Chapter 9, Dr. Frank. By the time I reached college age, I declared to my parents it was time for me to travel to the University of Oxford to attend a specialized program in reproductive science. Although I was initially altogether certain either of my parents were convinced about the sustainability of embryology, they changed their tune when I showed them an informative pamphlet I received in the mail detailing the accelerated program at Oxford, in which prospective students could receive both undergraduate and graduate degrees in reproductive science within the same amount of time it took a traditional student to receive their bachelor's in the United States. I was hesitant to travel so far away for my studies. I felt a certain degree of discomfort leaving my mother to my father's whims, even though I'd never been able to protect her from them, and Hannah, who I couldn't imagine not having close to me for that long. But just before the date of my impending departure, it so happened that the universe would throw a wrench into my plans, the first great tragedy of my young life, a sign of the horrors to come. But even before that, one of my worst fears would come true, my last summer at the country house. As I grew into my non-binary identity, it became increasingly difficult to carry the articles of clothing from these two lives back and forth in my backpack. I would have preferred a brown leather satchel, but alas, that was too masculine to get away with around my father and Ezra. Without drawing too much attention to myself, early in our time together, Hannah and I found this glorious deep emerald trunk we buried in the ground in this abandoned yard near our secret hiding place. It was the perfect makeshift locker for the clothing I would wear on my dates with Hannah, and a convenient place to keep the clothes I would wear back to the house so that my family wouldn't be the wiser. As time went on, I would find all kinds of clothing items to help me understand the ways in which I wanted to dress. Contemporary vests and waistcoats I wore over colorful button-down shirts, silk scarves I tied around my neck like my father's neckties, button suspender pants with leather suspenders to match, even fedoras and baseball caps that made me look like a boy when seeing my trousers in short fade from behind. I would often be called sir as someone passed me on the sidewalk or alerted me I dropped something on the ground. For those few moments before the person saw me on the other side and saw my feminine face, it would make my heart flutter to have the kalele in me recognized. I had a ritual that was comforting but also thrilling. I would sneak over to the abandoned grounds and gather my outfit for the afternoon, sometimes changing what was already waiting for me if I felt Hannah had seen it too many times in a row. For just a few hours, I would toss aside my form-fitting tank tops and snug denim, my jade earrings and silk headbands. I would change behind a copse of trees. Sometimes Hannah and I left little gifts for each other in the trunk before meeting. I would leave her gold bangles and books I knew she would love, and she would leave me seersucker bow ties and notebooks with leather flap tie closures to organize all of my ideas. But, as always happens with secrets, the longer you get away with them, the harder they are to keep. As the weeks passed, I grew increasingly confident that Hannah and I were safe in our little bubble in the town square. So safe it felt we were invincible to all except each other. It felt as though the universe had shielded us from the forces set to keep us apart, including my brother, who was once so dear to me, but who had become just another version of my father, except even worse somehow, because I had once allowed myself to be vulnerable to him. It was foolish, but of course, it is human nature that once the threat does not imminently appear, you believe you've gotten away with it. I had stopped looking over my shoulder every few seconds to see if Ezra or my father was behind me. Besides, by then, Ezra was often in town with my father, desperate to please him and learn the family business to take it over someday. I had stopped checking to see if any of my father's business associates or Hannah's mother were nearby as we kissed in secret, but out in the open in our hiding place behind the trees. Then one day, I knelt next to the ground I had touched so many times before. The ground was soft, as though it had already been cut open by some other tool, some other visitor. I stroked the ground next to our burial place with my hand. Its softness was not comforting to me. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was having one of those moments you have when you randomly become hyper-aware of the world around you. Perhaps Hannah had dug up the trunk shortly before our meeting to leave me one of her customary gifts. Besides, who else could possibly know our secret place in the dirt? I took the small trowel out of my backpack as always and dug until I unearthed the trunk. My hands were shaking so violently I struggled to open the latch. Hannah and I had never thought to buy a lock for it because there was never any need to. I almost didn't believe what I found when I lifted the trunk out of its hole in the ground and opened it. The trunk was empty. My heart began to clang in my chest like faulty machinery. All that remained was just one folded piece of paper with my name written on the top. As I lifted it uneasily to a reading distance, I immediately recognized the penmanship. Ezra, that wonderful darling boy with the golden ringlets, my cherished treasure, until Pa stole him away with his cruelty. The note only had one line inside. See you at home, Ez. I instantly burst into tears, thinking of how informed he attempted to make his assault on my life. How informal he attempted to make his assault on my life and the intimacies that mattered so much to me. I didn't have time to place the trunk back into the dark earth. I anxiously shoved the note into my jeans pocket and ran to find Hannah. I had arrived a bit earlier than our meeting time because I always like to have extra time to don my true gentlemanly skin for her. As anxiety shot in waves down the course of my body, my breath spurted out in rapid puffs from my lungs. The very reason I needed my legs to work in hyperdrive was why they were determined not to. The anxiety turned my legs into gelatinous mush attached to my waist. It became hard to run at the pace I needed to so that I could get to Hannah and she could tell me what to do or at least calm me down. If I could make it to her, I thought to myself, I would be all right. Hannah saw me through the glass wall attached to the door of the independent bookstore where I always found her. I could tell she knew something was wrong by the way she dropped the book she was holding in her hand and ran out of the bookstore to meet me. Z? She started, a look of concern falling across her face, her brows bending to meet one another. The trunk. Empty. Ezra. I managed to get out between accelerated breaths. She responded with a look of confusion. Since I still couldn't speak, I tore into my pocket and threw the note at her chest, more aggressively than I intended from fear and urgency. The seconds it took her to read the note felt achingly slow and long, as though the entire scene unfolding was submerged underwater. Then I saw her face slowly put the pieces together and match mine in anxiety and fear, which offered some strange sense of validation, a feeling I was no longer alone in it, even though I knew it was I who would pay the consequences. "Oh, Z!" she cried out, and pressed me against her chest. I tried to fight against her aims to soothe me. "How can you possibly understand what this is like? Your parents!" I snapped back at her, resentful of how alone I felt. But Hannah pressed her mouth against my ear and instructed me to inhale and exhale, her sweet breath calming me down whether I wanted to or not. I gradually felt my heart recede in my chest and my pulse quiet in my wrist. As the adrenaline coursing through my veins became softer and softer, I held on to her harder and harder, knowing it could very well be the last time I would see her. I was afraid to return home, but I knew I would have to face what stood on the other side of my front door sooner or later. I just didn't know if the monster behind the door was my father, as it had always been, or Ezra, my love, my brethren, my friend. Of course, he had been taken from me already, but I had still not wanted to fully admit it to myself. This was certainly the last way I wanted to be reminded of that fact. This time, when I took my leave of Hannah, I held her for so long, so much longer than I ever had before, because we both knew we might never see each other again. I touched her cheek just as she reached for my same cheek, and we stood like that for the longest, staring lovingly into one another's eyes. The world is full of uncertainty, but it is not quite the same as when one knows the uncertainty that lies within their grasp. What I hoped for when I reached our summer home: an empty driveway and street in front of the house, a house empty of my father, and Ezra, who would pretend the incident with the trunk never happened, that my clothes were stored somewhere safe by the boy I used to love so tenderly. Under my bed, perhaps, or deep in my closet. I conjured these visions in my mind so forcefully it made my head hurt, and I feared I would wrinkle my brow permanently. Of course, I knew they would never come true. These types of dreams or close calls never happened for girl boys like me, not with white feather fathers like mine. My father's car was parked in the driveway, as though it had always been there, but for a moment I stared at the house, its palatial white columns, its soft red bricks, its long brick walkway, the massive trees planted on the grass grown on both sides. It was dusk, and the light was orange in the sky, matching the warm lamps lit inside the house. How quaint the image appeared, how dishonest the architecture. The sweetness of the interior light seemed, knowing what was awaiting me. I walked slow and steady down the walkway, or at least I tried to, as though I were walking towards my doom. In a way, I was. My mother and grandmother were not in the living room with Ezra and my father when I shut the front door behind me. My father sat in his usual place, at his large beige armchair, where he watched television on the rare nights he would stop working. Ezra sat on the couch next to him, his upper torso leaning towards my father, while my father leaned backward in the chair. Ezra looked up when he saw me. My father's chair was facing away from me, so he didn't see me enter, but he undoubtedly was waiting for me and must have seen Ezra's eyes notice me. "Zoel, is that you?" he offered, as though he were not the father that he was. "Yes, it's me," I said as casually as I could. I didn't want to make a false assumption. Maybe Ezra would just use the trunk and its content as a threat to hold over my head forever. Wishful thinking was the only thing keeping me intact. "Come, sit down." He wheeled his chair around so he could see me, and then pointed toward the sofa next to Ezra. When I came around the side of my father and approached the sofa, I saw it. A small plastic crate filled with the contents from the trunk, taunting me from the glass coffee table on which the crate rested. A note from Hannah, the envelope seal broken. My favorite velvet vest, my patterned suspenders, my wool trousers. I tried not to let any expression show on my face. My father appeared strangely calm, perhaps because he didn't actually care. "I am glad to see you, Zoel. I take it these things are yours?" He peered at my face. Yes, sir," I deferred, taking my seat as far away from Ezra as I could, too enraged by his betrayal to even look him in the eye, even though he tried to make eye contact with me. "What is the meaning of this?" My father placed his hands delicately in his lap, but I knew better. I knew what my father was. He hadn't convinced me of his mercy, not even in the slightest. It was actually more unsettling that my father wasn't flying off the handle like he usually did with my mother, and I recalled how he had been with Ezra just a year before. I knew that each action was a move forward in the game of strategy we now played with one another, and I had best pick my move carefully. "I just enjoy wearing them. I keep them in the place Ezra found them because I only wear them when I am in town," I said calmly, measured. Maybe all that mattered was my Kalele, not Hannah. One could dream. "I see. And who do you wear them for?" "Myself, mainly." I hadn't lied yet. I wouldn't offer anything not directly asked of me about Hannah. He said, standing up and walking over to the crate. He rifled through the various items until he got to the note from Hannah. Opening the envelope, he pulled the note out with his long, thin fingers and read through it. It made me sick to think that my father would ever hold anything so intimate between us in his hands. Reading words meant only for me. I did my best to hide my innermost feelings. "Then who is this Hannah?" he asked, pronouncing her name incorrectly, perhaps intentionally. "Her name is Hannah," I said, correcting him. At that, he threw the note down with the envelope, his eyes red and menacing, Before I knew it, he was staring at me just inches away from where I sat. I looked up at his blue eyes, sharp like piercing metal. "Stand up," he spat into my face. I stood up quickly, quietly. "You dare to correct me? When you have been lying and behaving like this all this time? What is it with the two of you? What did I do to deserve such perverse spawn?" He looked briefly at Ezra, who held his head down in shame. "You," he said, his attention and focus back on me. "You are my own flesh and blood, and you still are so shameful. You disgust me." He leaned forward and smacked me in the face. The strike of his hand against the silence inside the house rang like two pieces of wood slapping against one another in one clean sound. My hand instinctively met my cheek, stinging and pulsating in pain, as I cried out once, and then held the pain against my tongue, remaining silent. He looked curiously at me. "Well, I will just do what I did with the evidence of Ezra's monstrosity. I will burn it in the backyard. But I want you to watch me do this, so you will know never to do this again," my father said, the heat retreating in his voice. "Ezra, thank you for your service. Your job is done. Please go to your room and prepare for our meeting tomorrow." Ezra nodded deferentially and left the room. My father and I walked outside together. As ordered, I carried the crate out to the backyard. The tin pail had been returned to where it usually sat on the desk, and I watched as those precious keepsakes that felt most true of my heart were burned against the blackness of the dark night. I never forgave my mother for her silence or her inaction. We never spoke of it. Shortly after the incident with the trunk, Ezra, who was now reaching his mid-teens, mysteriously caught measles. It was only when my mother pressed my father about how Ezra could have possibly caught such a serious illness at such a late and unexpected age that my father admitted neither he nor Ezra had been vaccinated. I had been vaccinated as a small child several years before my father brought Ezra into our lives. Only with Ezra's contraction of the illness did I learn that my mother's choice to vaccinate me was a source of contention between my parents. My father's parents had also chosen not to vaccinate my father. They believed not only that it was unimaginable that their child could become contaminated with such communicable diseases, but that the vaccine itself was a poison no longer necessary as these diseases, barbarian, as my father's parents called them, had already fallen away with the modern trends of sanitation and hygiene. My father was convinced modern vaccinations were just another way for doctors to take his money. Despite how abusive and unkind our father had been over the years, he and Ezra had become quite close since the fire incident. When he heard that Ezra had taken ill that summer, my father took several weeks off of work and moved back into the summer house with all of us full-time, while Ezra was in recovery. Seeing Ezra in such a tormented state sent my father into a severely distraught condition. But I knew it wasn't only because of Ezra's well-being he was suddenly so concerned, but also because Ezra was the child he had invested so much time and effort into teaching the family business to, so he could take it over one day. As the illness began to take its course, and Ezra's body became polka-dotted with small, red spots across his neck, arm, legs, and feet, it became impossible to keep my father away from him. At first, my father submitted to our warnings that Ezra needed to stay strictly quarantined inside of his room with no visitors and only receive soups, water, and medicines outside his door. But given that my father had always seen Ezra as a reflection of his own image, and that he still believed he was immune to such infectious diseases, he could not sustain his distance. While my mother and I were at the market gathering more ingredients for Ezra's daily soup, and my grandmother was taking a nap, my father stole into Ezra's room with a cool washcloth and a glass of water. Ezra coughed on my father's hands when he placed the cloth on his forehead. Within a matter of days, my father became very ill. Although Ezra was young enough to ultimately heal from the virus, my father was not so lucky. On his deathbed, my father joined Ezra's hands together with mine and declared a destiny that would intertwine our lives forever. I imagine he saw the vow he asked from us as a blessing. I would soon realize it was a curse, the very curse of my fateful future. I would realize it was not only our future happiness he demanded, but that he wanted his thriving business to never leave the hands of our family through the possible manipulations of another spouse. Ezra and Zoel, he began in a low, raspy voice through the dry coughs. I know I have not been the perfect father, but even still, I hate to leave you while your lives are just beginning. There is only one thing I ask. Please marry once you become of marrying age. This is the only way I can be assured the business will stay within our family. Zoe, you certainly cannot marry that dreadful woman from town. The world will never approve. Know that my eternal peace rests on your union. Please do not deny me this request, I beg you. Zoel, as the daughter, you must help your mother now. Ezra, you must take my place as the man of the house and provide for your cousin, your friend, your bride. I hope to see you in the afterlife, joined together as I join you now. Do not forsake me after all I've done for you. With that, my father fell into a deep slumber from which he did not wake. I did not feel much grief from seeing my father die, as he had only been a tyrant to me. He had transformed my brother from who he was meant to be, and had waged terror daily on my mother. I was more concerned with how Ezra would respond to this ridiculous demand. I tried to measure Ezra's reaction to this deathbed plea, but when I looked over at Ezra, his eyes were clouded with tears. He didn't make any move to speak to me or even glance my way. He held my father's hand so tight, I thought he might never let go. For several days my mother stayed in her room, and the entire house carried her as she wept. I imagine at times she wept out of grief for a man who gave her this life of comfort and privilege. But I wonder if she also wept out of relief he could no longer turn her into an object on which to project the complexity of his rage and ego. Due to our father's recent and heightened adoration of Ezra, exasperated by the guilt he felt over having inadvertently caused our father to become ill, Ezra fell into a deep state of despair. By the time my father died, I had come to terms with what my father had been, as well as what he could never become. Although I could acknowledge, at the very least, how unfortunate it was that my father had died before living a full life. But I was much more concerned with what would come of this promise he had determined Ezra and I fulfill. Soon I would depart for England, and given how deeply Ezra felt our father's loss, I grew worried this vow would become an obstacle preventing me from achieving my ambitions. I couldn't help but think about Hannah and what was possible in our future, of what would be foretold by my father's wishes. Would he control my life, even from the grave? Before I left for England, I knelt on the floor next to my mother's bedside, anxious about my father's words. It was now my obligation to support my mother in the chores he always saw as strictly women's work, such as cleaning, cooking, and managing the house. Ma? I gently touched her shoulder, afraid to wake her, even though she was constantly in bed at that time, processing her grief. Yes, Zoel, what is it? She mumbled, her eyes closed as she lay on her back without moving or making any effort to rise to a seated position. Pa told me I needed to stay home and help, I started, but she interrupted me before I could finish, sitting up quickly. Zoel, come into bed with me. She patted the space next to her. I crawled in, an unusual moment of closeness between us. No, I do not need help. Zoel, you are the one to prove to me why I married your father and came all this way to this new life and sacrificed so much happiness. Please, I beg you, go to England. Do wonders with that smart brain, she said, tapping her finger lovingly on my forehead. Do something with what your father gave us working so hard. Learn great things. Do great things, okay? Ezra will chase your father's dreams forever. I can't stop him. Please stay a few more days, then go to Oxford to big college, okay? I held her, a rare moment of affection between us. It was more than she had ever spoken to me. I imagined it was a lot for her. I didn't take it lightly. I delayed my trip for several days out of concern for Ezra, even though he never spoke to me, waiting to make sure he had moved through enough of his grief to withstand my departure. Even after everything, it was still hard to leave him in this much pain. I spent most of my remaining days in Texas with Hannah, now that I no longer had to look over my shoulder. Ezra looked at me coldly when he would see me leave the house, but I didn't care. We both knew there was nothing he could do to me. I tried to convince Hannah to come with me to Oxford to study literature while I pursued biomedical sciences, but she couldn't bear to leave her parents behind for that long. I didn't have the heart or energy to even argue that her parents always managed to come first. We met late the night before my departure, when Ezra, my mother, my grandmother, and grandmother were in the depths of their slumber. I had received a large inheritance from my father's death, and I spent a tiny portion of that money renting a room for us at a local inn not far from the center of town. It was on this night we finally consummated our great respect and love for one another. We spent all night together. The next morning, even as the sun rose in the sky, it was impossible to tear myself away from her. I had already confided in Hannah about my father's deathbed promise, but we were young and full of idealism and imagined a world in which this promise would not have to be kept, that defying the promise would not come with any serious consequences. How foolish we were! The only promise I cared about was the one I made to Hannah, that we would write to one another about our discoveries and inquiries. Hannah vowed to come up with a way to visit me before the end of my first quarter. That night, as we cuddled under blankets and talked with one another like girls and newly beloveds, we fantasized about what time together away from our families and anything we found familiar could be like. The next morning, I promised myself I would write to Ezra, even though he was no longer the sweet and delicate, tender heart I had remembered for so long. I wondered, since my father's influence over Ezra was fairly new, if I could bring back the old Ezra with my missives and memories of the sweet boy from before. However, the grief had already turned his demeanor and disposition even colder, and he was more removed than he had already been. I hoped it was not too late. Of course, I secretly wished that if I could get through to him, maybe I could convince him to forget about fulfilling my father's promise. As I gave my farewells, he offered me a melancholy and formal goodbye, kiss on each cheek in silence, his eyes two gray portals that I feared led only to a blankness or an obsession to fulfill his father's demand, to somehow make the pain of his loss less starkly felt. But I didn't give that fear too much mind. Although I was deeply sad to leave Hannah, I was much too excited about the journey awaiting me at the other end of that long flight, and all the greatness that I expected lay within reach. I had a need to feel I was somewhat sturdy in nature and disposition. In our family structure, when we were younger, it was little Ezra who was prone to fits of vulnerability and tenderness, whereas I always held my heart rather tight to my sleeve. However, on the seemingly endless flight to England, I allowed myself to indulge in the abject despondency I felt in being so alone and isolated from everyone and everything I knew. Not only would I make my way through the world on my own for the first time, but I would no longer have Hannah to accompany me on my intellectual quests. Even though I was too proud to admit that there was anything she could show me I didn't already know. I had become attached to our way of sharing ideas and writers, and having someone I could share my latest inquiries with. I was also worried I would find myself surrounded in a sea of white, unfamiliar classmates with whom I would share no commonalities or interests. Over the past few years, I had grown very dependent on Hannah and couldn't imagine any stranger supporting me as she had. Plus, I reflected to myself as the passengers to the left and the right of me slumbered. Through the journey over land and ocean, I couldn't imagine a scenario in which anyone's mind would match my own. Thoughts like these eventually prompted me to nod off for the last few hours of the flight, until at last I awoke to a view through the plain small window. The steeples I remembered from the images I found of Oxford during my research. My roommate met me at the airport. His name was Henry, and he had a dark head of black hair and a distinctly Chinese face. Although I imagine he came directly from the mainland and thus would be more conservative in his approach to research and cohabitation than I would prefer, his face immediately put me at ease. We took a car to our dormitories, where I threw my baggage at the floor of my small bare mattress and fell into an immediate and deep slumber.